Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the breakfast webinars of the semester. My name is Bhavna, and if you have any questions regarding technical support or any of that sort of thing, please let me know and please reach out. Very happy to see you all here. I'll give you a couple of instructions before we begin. Just keep your microphone muted until you want to speak up. And use the Zoom chat. I think the speakers have decided to keep the questions towards the end, and your moderator would more or less help you out with that. But if you have any questions at all during while you're listening to the webinar, feel free to type up your questions in the chat. And during the discussion session, we would ask you to use the raise hand feature if you wish to ask questions and ask them personally. And for the upcoming webinars that we have for the breakfast webinars, please look at our website at itrl.kth.ac/events. We have a few more webinars coming up before the semester ends, and both of them are pretty interesting, so we would really like you to sign up. And now I hand over to Eric, our moderator for the day.
Thank you, Bhavna. Yeah, I'm happy that we have so many people joining today. My name is Erik Almlöv, and I'm a PhD student here at ITRL. So our director sent me this paper about 2 months ago with the phrase like, this might be of interest to you. And I immediately found the title compelling and the abstract likewise. I read through it and sent it to another coworker who read it as well. And afterwards, we were discussing this paper, saying that this is really relevant and that more people should know about the conclusions in this paper. And as you might be aware of, here at ITRL, we try to bring in like different perspectives and involve different stakeholders from different fields. And last breakfast seminar, we talked about how to remotely control a vehicle, which is a more of a hands-on engineering approach. And those of you who have worked with us know that we have, for example, ongoing tests with autonomous technology in our lab. But we also like to discuss societal impacts and discuss both pros and cons with new technologies or new concepts. And today we would like to welcome you all to listen to our two speakers who will address the potential inequality aspects of autonomously driven taxis. And I would like to hand over to our guests from Monash University in Australia, Robert Sparrow, who's a professor in philosophy, and Mark Howard, who is a PhD and research fellow, and who both study ethics aspects of new technology. Good morning, Rob and Mark, or should I rather say good evening, perhaps?
Good morning or good evening. So thank you, everyone, for turning out for the Breakfast Centre, and thank you to the Centre for the invitation to present. We're presenting published work today. It's a paper that came out in a journal called Mobilities, which is a geography journal, and it reports some research that Mark and I have been conducting for the last couple of years, thinking about, we're trying to think in advance about ethical questions that might arrive should a particular vision of autonomous vehicles come about. We're going to try to present in 30 minutes, which means that we will be moving through the material reasonably quickly, but we're doing that in order to have some time for discussion. And if people want to get their heads around the detail of the argument, they could always check out the published manuscript. It's been a sort of difficult journey in some ways to get this paper published, because in this work we're doing at least two controversial things. One, we're assuming a particular future for connected autonomous vehicles or driverless vehicles, and that future of a mobility as a service model with the roads dominated by driverless vehicles of the sort that have no steering wheels. So sort of high-speed transport pods for hire. That vision for the future, in a way, actually became more controversial as our research proceeded, because we were writing at a particular stage of the hype cycle. And as I'll say more in a moment, we bought into that. So we're making some pretty big assumptions about what might be possible to do to transport or with transport with autonomous vehicles. But we're also picking a fight with an argument about the virtues of markets as well, and whether or not extending road pricing that people have often thought to do on freeways or with congestion taxes, whether extending that to the entirety of the road transport network would be a good thing to do or not. So hopefully there's something for everybody to object to in the paper, but I hope you will at least allow us the technological assumptions for the sake of the argument, and then we can argue about the politics and the ethics at the end. So to be a bit clearer about what we are assuming, we're going to believe, for the sake of this paper, in a future in which the roads are dominated by connected autonomous vehicles. And by autonomous vehicles, we mean SAE level 4 or level 5 cars that can essentially drive themselves. And we have argued in another piece of work that either driverless vehicles aren't as good at avoiding third-party casualties as human beings, in which case you shouldn't allow them on the roads, or they reduce casualties to third parties, in which case you shouldn't let us drive anymore. So in a paper called When Human Beings Are Like Drunk Robots, Mark and I argued that there's a strong ethical case for moving, once this technology reaches a certain level of capability, to essentially prohibiting human drivers from private roads. And then we realized, so I take it that some people won't believe that that's likely. You can still find people in the literature who are looking forward to a future like that. And it is actually remarkably hard to justify to have a position where you think it's morally permissible to put level 4 or level 5 vehicles on the road and not morally required to. But we think that some fairly radical implications for the way in which people think of and use transport would follow from that world, which is essentially, once cars can drive themselves, we don't think it makes any sense to own one as a private individual. We believe that people would move fairly quickly towards embracing a mobility as a service model, where you essentially contract with an organisation to provide transport services, drop a pin on your mobile phone about where you are now, where you want to go, and a driverless vehicle comes and picks you up. So that's what we're going to imagine. And as Mark will explain to you in a moment, that then opens up new opportunities for the pricing of transport.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Yeah, so as Rob's given a basic outline there too, that our argument's looking at a specific idea of the market that will be opened up when we bring together connected automated vehicles and a MaaS system. One of the key ideas is that that'll head us towards a dominant model of access to the roads being priced on a per trip basis. And once that's possible, we'll also see the possibility to charge different prices for different levels of access and different services. So there's at least two means that could be used under this system to provide priority access to the roads. The first we've considered is a centralised or a cloud-based dynamic traffic management system. And this would be a system built explicitly for this purpose, to be able to enable pricing per trip and the sort of individual management of trips on the roads. So under this model, in the simplest case, we might end up with people who pay more get picked up sooner. The automated vehicle will just prioritise you and come and get you before someone else who's booked at the same time. Perhaps more significantly, a centralised system like the one we envisioned might be able to monitor and thereby shape or influence the interactions between all the vehicles across the entire road network. And it might do this in order to provide people who had paid more with shorter journey times. This also has an array of mechanisms, so it might involve reserving certain advantageous routes, or perhaps more ambitiously, it might actually shape individual interactions between vehicles. And again, enabling those who paid more to arrive at their destinations more quickly. So as long as vehicles can communicate with each other under this model, and there are independent reasons for governments to demand that autonomous vehicles are able to communicate with each other. A lot of the benefits talked about with automated vehicles rely on vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure communication. So as long as they can do that, then it's possible for cars that have paid lower prices to be allocated to less advantageous routes, or perhaps they might even be slowed down, pulled across to the curb to allow the cars of those who have paid more to get past. The second means that we've looked at or considered is that to develop markets in mobility on the roads, an ideal way to do this would be through the controlling of interactions between vehicles at intersections. So again, building on this assumption that we're hoping you're going to grant us, where the vehicles on the roads are all automated and that they're connected vehicles, then it should be possible to organise passage through intersections by reaching some kind of agreement between the vehicles regarding which vehicle should go through first or what vehicle should go through at what time. One way that this negotiation might be managed is through, I guess, like a form of online auction or a bidding system, where to pass through the intersection, there will be certain slots allocated. Those who pay the highest price are given the priority slots to move through. And this could be also based on the vehicles with higher trip prices, therefore having more resources to be able to bid their way through these intersections and to gain privilege. So, if the logic of the free market, as we're thinking will occur, is unleashed on urban transport, there's good reasons to believe that pricing journey times in accordance with the ability to pay is going to be the dominant sort of model. And this is kind of backed up by what we've looked at with transport economists, who are generally suggesting that governments favour market-based solutions, and that is the way that they will head with transport policy. So when this technology does allow pricing of differential access, we expect to see this kind of a system roll out and become the dominant model. Okay, thanks, Rob.
So I hope you can see now why we have titled our paper "Make Way for the Wealthies," because in the world that we're imagining, an invisible technological infrastructure will require people to make way for the wealthy. You'll be able to outbid people for access to the road system. Now, I think for some people, this is just seems utterly unremarkable. And in a moment, I'm going to run through some precedents and analogies that suggest that in lots of contexts, we've already essentially reached a social consensus that it's appropriate to allow people to purchase better access to transport. But at the same time, we want to emphasize the way in which interactions in public space are deeply felt, but as indicators of status between individuals. And at the moment, while there's all sorts of ways in which, I mean, the very existence of a road system privileges certain sorts of people, once you're on the roads, you meet as equals. You might be driving a Jaguar, I'm driving an old bomb, very old and shabby vehicle. But when we're on the road together, I don't have to make way for you. So we think that and in fact, this has been our experience, part of the audience just says, nothing to see here. This is absolutely what we should do. We should price transport using this new technology. And another part of the audience thinks that this is outrageous because it says something about our attitudes towards each other when we are willing to privilege the needs of some people over others. So let me talk now briefly about a series of relevant precedents and analogies that we've identified in our research. As I've just intimated, just having a transport system based around motor vehicles and roads is already serving people who can afford private vehicles, for instance, over people who can afford only buses or have to travel by foot or by bicycle. In all sorts of ways, roads tend to get directed to where there's a demand for them, and that demand has to be expressed through car usage, which means it's demand from people who can afford vehicles. So when societies chose to invest in road networks and private vehicles, they already privileged the transport needs of some people over others. In lots of places around the world, there are toll roads. Melbourne, Victoria, where we're presenting from, has an extensive network of toll roads that enable people to purchase shorter journey times. Various cities around the world have experimented with congestion charging or introduced congestion charging. And again, this says that if you're wealthy enough, you can go into town, you don't worry about paying the fee. Whereas these charges may effectively work to exclude some people or force them to change their transport choices. Something closer to what we imagine is the existing institution of high occupancy transit lanes, where only cars, I mean, originally the idea was only people who were carpooling or cars that contained multiple passengers gained access to a less congested lane. There are now situations where you can essentially, pay on your mobile phone for access to some of these lanes as you're driving. Say, I'm running a bit late, I'm prepared to pay more, get on the express lane. Anyone who, back in the day when we could travel by aeroplane, you would have the experience of watching people who had higher, frequent flyer status or traveler status or whatever it was, have shorter queues, walk through ahead of you, or indeed the really wealthy have separate airports. So we have that experience already of giving way to the wealthy, or enjoying the privileges of wealth and requiring other people to make way for us. So those are all fairly familiar examples. Here's a couple more that we think may change people's intuitions. The historical institution of having to literally give way to nobility. So at various historical moments, when the nobles were on the roads, the peasants had to get out of the way. And if they didn't get out of the way, they were sort of kicked and whipped and moved aside for the sake of the transport of the wealthy. And we see here the connection between access to public space and status. That idea that I need to step aside because my social superior wants to use the footpath is quite confronting for those of us with egalitarian sensibilities. Now, the other context in which a similar set of issues has been thrashed out is debates about what's called net neutrality. So the idea that when it comes to the access provided to data on the internet, all data should be treated equally. What that means is that, for instance, people can't slow down your access to the internet for the sake of speeding up someone else's if they've paid more money. And in those debates about net neutrality, there has been a strong public expression of the idea that when it comes to transport of our data on the internet, people demand that they should have equal access and not access that is priced. So there's a series of analogies there, and depending upon which of those you find more compelling, you may find the argument in favour of markets for mobility expanding as a result of connected autonomous vehicles more or less compelling. Over to you, Mark. You're muted.
Yeah, so as Rob's sort of gone through those precedents and analogies, obviously one thing that's going to jump out is that there are already some markets in certain forms of mobility, and they appear in certain instances to have been accepted. But regardless of this, there are still significant sort of social, political, ethical costs to be considered when we think about distributing mobility in accordance with an ability to pay. And we think that these costs are going to be particularly high under the scenario that we're considering. The three sorts of costs that we have sort of identified as being particularly important, and also ones that we think should be of primary concern to policymakers, will vary across dependent on whether they are visible to road users or whether they're invisible. And the first of the costs that we considered was the psychological and social impacts of this demand to make way for the wealthy. So these types of costs are associated with the experience of social status. In these exchanges, people are going to be constantly reminded of their place in the social pecking order. This will occur through the interactions between their vehicles and the vehicles of others who have perhaps paid more and make them pull aside. And these exchanges are also going to occur in a very public environment. It's not just going to be you experiencing, all the other road users might see that your car has been pulled aside to the curb to allow people to go past. And there's a sort of growing body of evidence that suggests status inequality, such as the type we're talking about, has negative effects on happiness, on well-being, and that's both for those who are privileged, perhaps surprisingly, but certainly for those who are disadvantaged by the interaction. We're also suspicious that the harms caused may be amplified as some of the exchanges between the vehicles might feel more individual, or they might feel highly personalised. So when my car pulls aside, I see you behind me, my car pulls aside, and suddenly I see you go past me as I wait for you to go past. Also, mobility based on networked automated vehicles has the potential to make these kind of experiences ubiquitous. So when we consider the time that urban populations tend to spend in transportation and on the roads, there's a chance that this is going to be a daily occurrence and a daily experiences for lots of people. But even if we, for some reason, do become accustomed to the experience of making way for the wealthy, there's still social costs associated with accepting that wealthier people might have rights of way. The historical example of the commoners and nobility that Rob touched on is a good way to highlight this. And the reason we think that this is confronting is because it offends against the ideal of egalitarianism. The right to occupy a space in the world is important to us. As individuals, it's important to our expressions of moral and political status. So a good way to think about this is, say, through examples of gendered or racial hierarchies. And it's often within these hierarchies that restrictions are placed on who can go where, how they can go there, when they can go there. There's a history of where people could occupy public transport, where they could share facilities, or who can even just enter public without chaperones, etc. So one of the major concerns is that this idea that the poor may have to make way for the wealthy, this could communicate that the interests of the wealthy are more important. And a growing concern, or a larger concern coming out of this, is that by regularly recognising these sorts of status distinctions and status inequalities, and certainly if they end up entrenched in public policy, it could undermine egalitarian sentiments more generally. So we think these are really significant and should be accounted considerable cost when we're thinking about markets and mobilities in the road. The second sort of cost we've considered is around social justice and the idea of invisible privilege. So systems are designed to allow the wealthy to move through space more freely, are going to constitute the building of inequality into the transportation infrastructure of cities. And some of the ways this may occur also could be invisible to road users. So we've acknowledged that the very existence of roads already privilege some interests of the wealthy, but by building this into the very infrastructure of transportation, to provide mobility to the wealthy is going to exaggerate any of these phenomena that we've come across previously. It also raises this idea of potentially creating mobility ghettos. So this is ideas where suddenly the poor are banished to less advantageous and more dangerous road routes while we preserve safer and quicker routes for those who've paid more. And with the invisibility of some of these systems, it's also a challenge more broadly to the notion of sort of public reason, this ideal of transparency, that we should be afforded democratic oversight into public policy. And it's certainly going to be difficult when we see our transportation controlled by centralised decision-making systems, by algorithms we don't understand, and also when we're not experiencing the full range of these impacts on our mobility. And the final sort we looked at is just this idea tied up with creating a free market in mobility, and that's with the idea of privatising of public space. Rob's already kind of touched on this, but if you're sympathetic to free markets, you might not really be feeling that convinced with what we're saying. You might say, well, look, capitalism is premised on this idea that markets distribute goods efficiently, and they don't need to be unjust. As I said, policymakers are actually increasingly looking at markets to deliver public goods. But what this line of objection does highlight is that the introduction of markets into mobilities is in fact premised on an effective privatisation of the use of road networks. So what we've sort of considered as public space is suddenly subject to private control and more likely to control by large corporations. And if we privatise access to all roads, it becomes especially problematic for a number of reasons. What we see is a mass model premised on privatisation will be an enclosure of a resource that we've considered public and that in the past has been funded by public monies. It's also likely to result in private corporations controlling access to a good that is essential to social and political participation. So we think, and our argument is in part that it's appropriate that governments should step in and regulate operations in markets in goods where they're impacting fundamental social goods such as mobility. Mobility is normally serving other purposes. It's underpinning forms of social, economic, and political participation. So if we increase inequalities in mobility, it's not purely in the sense of mobility itself. It's then also producing inequalities in other areas such as I mentioned economics, political participation, social participation. And this is likely to entrench because of the nature of the centralised system, entrench and exacerbate social inequality across multiple dimensions. And ultimately, and I'm sure Rob will probably touch on this more in his final wrap up, but what this is going to be an affront to anyone who considers an account of social justice that emphasises equality of opportunity. Okay, Rob.
I'm not sure that I am going to say that, Mark. I guess, not least because you've just said it. One of the, as I remarked at the beginning, one of the hard things about presenting this work is that what seems to us a potential bug will, I think, seem to a lot of people to be a feature of this system. So I suspect people's responses to this idea that we should use the the technological potential of connected autonomous vehicles to extend pricing to the entirety of the road network, and every minute of time on the road could be priced efficiently according to the market. Whether you see that as being a wonderful opportunity to achieve all the benefits that markets achieve, or whether you see it, as Mark has suggested, as an affront to egalitarian intuitions about equality of opportunity, people's right to access public space, and the connection between mobility and other forms of social and political participation, that's going to depend in part on what you think of the virtues of the market. But we do want to emphasize that there is something, that this would be a massive extension of the market. So to really, yes, to encompass the whole of the road network and all the time that people spend on the road network if they're using a connected autonomous vehicle, that those goods then become amenable to distribution according to the market, which effectively means that many of us will be required to make way for the wealthy in a large part of our lives where currently we think of ourselves as being situated as equals in relation to each other. It also has to be said that that there's a disjunct here between what transport economists think of as good social policy and what the public tends to express when these kinds of proposals have been made in other areas. So congestion charging, for instance, or the toll roads or high occupancy transit lanes have all traditionally been met with a great deal of public skepticism and resistance. At the very least, we think that pragmatically, if policymakers do wish to explore the option that we're drawing attention to of pricing transport on the roads using this new technology, they need to take those concerns serious, that public resistance to markets here seriously. And then I think we also believe that the substantive political questions about the role, the place, proper place of the market in a democratic society should be taken seriously in their own terms as well. We look forward to questions and discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob and Mark. And yeah, I'm opening up the floor for questions. If something was unclear, for example, if you have any wish for Rob or Mark to elaborate on a certain topic. If someone actually use this more as a feature than a bug, then I think that it would be really interested for you to pose a question or actually say what you think about this, and we can have sort of a open discussion. And I hope that Rob and Mark are open to discussion and not just questions as well. So please use the chat function, or maybe the raise hand as well you can do. And then we'll let you in. But I can start a bit. And you talk about in this paper, I actually directly in the abstract of it, and you say that this type of solution would be an economically efficient way of allocating access to the scarce good of space on the roads. So, you're definitely saying that this has a lot of advantages as well. And I was wondering a bit about policy implications as well. Do you see how should we actually govern this to be both take in the good things about this, but also taking an equity aspect as well?
So Mark, I'll have a first go at that, and then feel free to add anything. Look, clearly one of the ways we think that something like this system might evolve is the police and the emergency services asking for the ability, not just as they can sometimes do in some countries now, is reset all the traffic lights if they need to speed up, but actually hit a big button on the dashboard and everyone gets out of their way. And yeah, we think there would be virtues in that. We're also interested in doing some research on what look to be progressive social policy options made available by this technology. So, for instance, free transport to the hospitals, for instance. You could there are other ways that you could use this technology to price transport differently. You could say, look, if you're going to buy cigarettes, that's becoming, more expensive. If you're going to the hospital, or you're going to university or whatever it is, something that we think is socially validated, then we reduce the price. So there are other policy options made available if we can really provide, shift transport according to destination or time of. You could do the congestion pricing very efficiently. You could smear the traffic peaks very efficiently by asking, travel earlier and it's cheaper. There are a lot of things that you could achieve this way. It's also generally reasonably widely believed that the negative externalities of people's transport choices on the roads are not taken into consideration by current pricing mechanisms. So, for instance, the fact that I slow you down when I choose to drive, that's not reflected in the price of my journey. So we can see that people who are maybe, there is a sense in which markets treat people as equals. Anyone who's got the money in the bank can buy access to this good. So, this is inequality. It always looks like equality from another perspective. Everyone has an equal right to purchase. In practice, that means that some people are systematically advantaged. So there are some deeper questions about what kind of equality governments should be pursuing here. That also are in the background here. So we don't. We did want to draw attention to this possibility. The stuff that Uber is doing already could be repurposed for more progressive ends by governments who wanted to make use of this technology. But having the power to do that raises a whole set of political questions that we don't think people are thinking about enough.
Yeah. Do you want to add something, Mark, to that answer?
Yeah, just a couple of things. So I think Rob's covered it very well, but probably just extending the conversation a little bit as well, and why this is a really important consideration is, so one of the potential benefits of automated vehicles is that access is provided to people to roads who currently don't have great access to mobility. So we might see young people, we might see people with disabilities that discount them from access to the roads, or having personalised mobility suddenly accessing the roads. So one of the potential incomes is that we actually see an increase in traffic on the roads, and so there is a way that we certainly need to find mechanisms to try and get the best results from this. So certainly we can see the appeal of an idea of efficiency and sort of incentivizing different patterns of road use. But then that obviously needs to be balanced again with how that's meted out. So with markets, it's typically, if you can afford to pay, you'll get priority, and that's how we'll manage it. There's sort of a history, I guess, in other disciplines, such as health, for example, where maybe you come up with differential access based on needs. And Rob sort of touched on this where we're talking about, we're currently investigating the idea that you might get free access to hospitals, or you might get free access to other services, etc. So it's not that essentially differential access is unequal. It's just that the markets might achieve a means that exacerbates inequality, and there could be other means and other considerations that we need to take into account, such as need or egalitarian. Hopefully, I was sort of curious if there was people who've been working on these sort of questions, who have ideas about how to allocate this resource. Once we have vehicles on the road, I'd be curious to know what people are actually doing. As it, in a lot of the literature around this, efficiency, when we're looking at market-based, efficiency is considered a higher good. So if you achieve efficient distribution of goods, then that tends to be trumping other forms of distributive justice. So do you have a point to come back on, Rob?
Yeah, I just wanted, Eric, I'll be brief, but I just, I'm loving that comment about the difference in transport safety if you're in a good car versus a poor car. Because actually, when we published this paper, I was contacted by an American graduate student, and it was one of those emails where I just genuinely did not know whether they were serious about the proposal, but they suggested that, as there are philosophers all over the world debating this question about who should my vehicle kill in these forced, these kind of forced accident scenarios. And he suggested that you should actually just be able to purchase a higher priority for saving your life. That when it came, so that you could actually design into the collision avoidance algorithm, the two vehicles quickly, as they hurtle towards each other, quickly communicate, who's paid more for their insurance, and then shape the collision in those terms. And I still to this day don't know whether this was someone embracing the logic of the paper and extending it, or someone pointing to a reductio, but to a silly implication. But I do think that that comment really draws attention to the fact I have a strong repugnance to the idea that poor people should be more likely to be killed as a result of an infrastructure built into the road network to allow that, even if it were economically more efficient, which I think the same arguments would apply. So great comment, but it really shows this clash of intuitions between an economic mode of thinking and maybe a political mode of thinking.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Håkan, for that comment. I'm gonna hand over to Anna Pernestål, who has been raising hand for quite a while. I hope you're not too tired.
No, it's okay with the digital hand. So a little bit connecting back. Thank you very much for bringing up a super interesting and important topic that I also think is not so well discussed. And so I'm thinking, referring back to this, who should the autonomous vehicle kill question? And that question has been quite frequently debated, and there are games that you can play to see what you think in this question and what you think compared to others. But have you with this work, I think it's important that, or my opinion is that it's important that this bug or feature or whatever it is actually discussed. Have you done some work in engaging both policymakers but also like normal people to start to think about those questions?
So we have promoted this paper to the best of our ability, and we have spoken about it in other transport policy fora. It is there is a structural problem with the argument, is that people will split on it depending on whether or not they are already in the sort of that portion of the transport policy community that has simply resolved that road pricing is good, and a public who in some ways I think probably aren't sufficiently aware of the potential of road pricing, though again, one has to be a bit careful about the potential of road pricing. Markets often promise an efficiency which isn't realized in practice, and there's, the establishing of markets always relies on a set of political choices about what counts as a good that can be bought and sold. I mean, one of the questions here is, all this infrastructure that has been built on the public purse in the future might be distributed by Uber or Google or whoever it is, and there are policy decisions involved in making that possible. So, I mean, we are doing our best to try to draw attention to these questions. The who should they kill debate we haven't really spoken about before, in part because in my experience, engineers have responded very badly to philosophers' role in that debate, because they think that this has a technical solution. These cars will never crash, or they think that there are, you can just take the public's preferences and build them into the algorithms. And I mean, we don't think that, but it's not much fun. Yeah, I don't know what your experience is, but if you mention the trolley problem nowadays in this kind of community, people tend to wince. And so, yeah, we haven't really been speaking about the idea that you might buy your way out of a collision yet.
Would you like to answer as well, Mark? Yeah.
I was just build a little bit on my own experience with discussions around what we talk about in this paper. And it's interesting, I went to a webinar and also spoke with the second in charge at Infrastructure Victoria. So that's a body in the state that Rob and I live in Australia, who overlooks infrastructure development, including roads. And they're currently working on a policy position that is very much based around this idea of incentivizing behaviours on the roads by going away with we presently have a system where we pay a registration for a vehicle, and then unless you're on a toll road, you don't incur any additional charges. They're seriously considering this idea of extending the notion of tolls and moving away from a general registration and starting to move, if possible, towards a per trip pricing already with our transportation system. So they're very attracted to the idea that it gives them a way to control transportation movement. They're very attracted to the idea also that they might be able to remove some of the responsibility for our infrastructure out of the hands of government and on to private bodies. And to be honest, when I spoke to him about our paper, because he was already, and this is a difficulty that we confront, he thought that the sort of position we promote was actually obstructionist. So, causing problems, causing problems for public policy, and, sort of not recognising the direction that things are going. And that is something we confront. And there's a real push towards markets in public goods. And there's a whole array of literature about the issues of that. Certainly we suddenly have an introduction of, rivalry regarding access. We have capacity to exclude people from these goods where public goods are meant to be non-excludable. So there's this really dramatic shift, but not all, but some of the conversations I've had with public policy bods don't tend to recognise the importance of this, which is, I guess, why Rob and I are out here on the hustings trying to promote this idea.
Nice, thank you. I'm going to turn to a question from the chat from Alonso Espinosa Mireles de Villafranca, which is about public transport and how you think that this could, how like the balance between, I guess, road traffic and public transport. And he says that, first of all, actually pricing the use of car might be sort of adding extra cost to the car in one sense, and also the extra pricing of the roads could, for example, lead to a different use of land use. But on the other hand, it could be an extra convenience of this like autonomous mass service or whatever. And how do you think about this competition sort of between the car mode and the public transport?
So that's a great question. And I mean, in other work, Mark and I have advocated quite strongly for the use of shared autonomous vehicles as a last mile transport system. And that if you were serious about maximizing the benefits from this technology, you would invest heavily in sort of arterial public trains or public transport, and then have people, I mean, if they can't ride bicycles, in shared minibuses. So the idea that this is a technology that could be used in ways other than to extend the life of the automobile is something that we're quite sympathetic to. I guess I think what I think about this is it shows how political markets always are. That the question of the price of a good always involves policy choices. So we don't price the deaths due to diesel pollution in transport. We don't price the ambulance services. We don't price the impact on real estate. I mean, you could, if you wanted to, you could try to build all of that stuff in to get the real, and what you would discover is that there wasn't really a market, or the market only exists on the basis of a prior set of political choices. And then I'm just not sure that it's realistic to expect that battle to be won by people who promote public transport or who want to include more of the social costs of the automobile in the price. So I think that's, if you imagine the sort of companies that are promoting autonomous vehicles and mobility as a service, they have a lot of capacity to resist. Someone says, look, okay, that's great, but we're going to fully cost automobile transport, and now it's massively expensive, so all your customers would have to take the tram. I simply can't see that battle being won in practice politically, I guess. So I think it's, I think that question raises really important issues, but I think it would be naive to think that moving towards this kind of journey pricing would in fact function as an opportunity to price private vehicles more, well, private transport choices more, more realistically.
Hi, thanks for your in-depth answer. I was also thinking like, yeah, like I agree, like it's maybe a bit naive to think like that that massively pricing road transport will lead to like because it's not in the best interest of the companies that might end up providing the service or of the government, but maybe including some of these externalities into road pricing might lead to like maybe use of road from something other than transport, like for other public goods like parks and recreational space, rather than seeing if road is also made more efficient, like road transport, because of connected automated vehicles. And might this not be something that might end up playing a role, or is this a bit too far-fetched in your opinion?
I don't think we would claim that we are. I mean, there's a whole series of reasonably foreseeable social and political consequences toward of the development of autonomous vehicles that we're not discussing here. So, you know, if people genuinely don't need private vehicles anymore, then all their garages become space that you could either use to expand individual dwelling size, which would probably be bad, or increase urban density, that might be good. The increased access to transport provided by these technologies might, I don't know, increase the social mobility of people in advanced old age, or it could just clog up the roads as everybody sends their pets to pet school in a car by themselves. I mean, there's a whole lot of other stuff that might go on. Again, I think you just want to emphasize this is a political question. This is a future that needs to be contested by people. And in some ways, what makes this an exciting area to be working in is that there is an opportunity to ask some fairly fundamental questions about the contribution that we want cars and roads to make to our shared collective future. Now, in that debate, there are other things you would be thinking about, the environmental costs of these choices as well. There's a lot more that needs to be said here. But I do think, I mean, interestingly, when people have pitched road pricing, they usually pitch it as, precisely as providing other benefits, reducing congestion, cleaning the air. We're going to reinvest the money that we made from the congestion tax into social services. And again, that just shows you that this is it's not simply markets, it's always politics as well.
Mark, do you want to elaborate a bit on this question as well?
Yeah, so probably just following on a little bit from what Rob said. I think one of the things this really highlights is, so we often sort of hear from people who are taking a position of economic rationalism, or the idea of approach to free markets, that somehow that by taking that stance we remove the political questions. We're sort of saying, now that's actually naive. There are always political underpinnings. There's always social consequences. There's always choices made as part of this. So this is, I guess, one of the things we're trying to push back against, that, this approach to distribution of goods based on efficiency, based on economics, is political. It's not objective as it was initially thought when this kind of approach was developed. As we sort of say in the paper, this idea of a market of mobility based on mass, based on autonomous vehicles, sort of what it really says, it's either going to challenge a democratic conception of how we should interact in a public space, or it's revealing the likelihood that public space is going to be effectively privatised. So, sort of either of those outcomes are very significant political in their nature. Yeah.
We actually have more questions in the chat, but unfortunately we're out of time. And I would really like to thank Robert and Mark for their talk. and also from the audience for these good questions as well. And I really encourage you to reach out to Rob and Mark, and I hope I won't spam your inboxes too much. But yes, please join us for our next BREC seminar, which is, I think, sometimes in May, right, Vanna?
Yes, it's in May. It's on the 4th of May, I think. And it's on ITRL research on COVID-19 and its effects on transport. It should be a really interesting one too. So yeah, more than happy for all of you to join us. And thank you so much, Rob and Mark, for joining us today. But yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.